As 2018 was drawing to a close, in the flurry of environment stories that I'm fed daily by social media, two pieces of news coverage caught my eye. The first story, a report that a high-tech device designed to clean up the so-called Great Pacific Garbage Patch was having teething problems. Problems during pilot tests taking place out at sea. The giant floating barrier was managing to scoop up plastic debris, but it was also managing to lose it. The youthful inventor of System 001 was perplexed. Engineers were hurriedly trying to create a fix. Their innovation is described as a moonshot effort. Results from aircraft surveys show that the rubbish-strewn oceanic gyre is growing exponentially. This great waterborne mass of detritus is said to litter an expanse more than twice the size of France. Marine ecologists, meanwhile, voice their own reservations about this multi-million-dollar mop-up effort. While the removal of larger items, such as ghost fishing nets, will help wildlife, System 001 is not, they note, designed to deal with the colossal amount of microplastics that are said to be impacting all forms of life at sea. Nonetheless, the cinematic horror of a plastic ocean has certainly provided a powerful imaginary, implanting it in the public consciousness. All those recent recovery efforts notwithstanding, the current state of our oceans is said by some scientists to be nearing a planetary boundary, the term that's used to describe safe operational environmental limits within which the world can continue to function safely. The second story. By the banks of the River Thames, on the concourse outside Tate Modern, art lovers and passers-by were being drawn in by an unusual sight. An assembly of ice blocks weighing between 1.5 and 6 tons, each one performing a durational slow melt. Ice Watch London was a purposely short-lived work. It was put up by the celebrated Scandinavian artist Olafur Eliasson and his collaborator, the Greenland geologist Minnick Rosing. Their outdoor exhibit was timed to coincide with the UN COP24 conference held in Katowice, Poland. Each block of ice had been fished out of Nuuk Kangerlua Fjord after it had broken away from the Greenland ice sheet. The ice was then transported in fridge containers to the UK, just like the ones that bring your frozen prawns to Selfridges, Rosing quipped to the Guardian's arts correspondent. And here's the rub. The intention was crystal clear. Public art as a vehicle to bring the effects of climate change considerably closer to home. Ice Watch London had the desired effect. What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, one observer tweeted. Displaced, strangers, nature at the heart of civilization and capital, tweeted another. Other visitors, the ones that you can see pictured here, bent in close, spellbound at this improbable encounter with a melting world, cupping an ear to listen for popping and fizzing sounds. Rosing, the geologist, supplied the facts to sit alongside these special effects. Quote, "The air releasing from the ice was trapped before we started polluting the atmosphere. Those bubbles have almost half the CO2 content as the air outside the iceberg. It was trapped 10,000 years ago, maybe 100,000 years ago. So you can smell what air used to smell like before we polluted it. And you can take a drink of it. Beautiful, natural water." So what was it that struck me about those two stories, such that I feel compelled to pair them and then report them back to you today? Evidently, they speak of our planetary predicament, of a world worryingly unanchored, seemingly adrift from its safe moorings. They speak to us of our current conjuncture, when responses to anthropogenic climate change, habitat destruction, and species extinction, whether those responses are scientific, technical, or artistic, they command our attention, and they generate a fretful, pensive public mood. Additionally, within those two stories, there are imaginative resources internal to them, internal to their narratives, that I want to later return to in my talk and consider. Because as my muse, I've chosen things adrift, matter and molecules, free floating in maritime and atmospheric environments. And I've chosen them as a means to configure what we now commonly refer to as our more than human worlds. Ultimately, what my talk will do is take us to a point where I'll suggest at the end, or wonder about what a theory of drift might yet afford socio-ecological thought. But more immediately, the same two stories also serve, I think, as quite useful reference points in helping orient us on an intellectual map of our changing academic discipline, New Cultural Geography. The two stories certainly point us towards contemporary cultural geography, where of late the contours of inquiry, of criticism, and of commentary have shifted to encompass all that we now refer to collectively as the more than human. Now, allow me just the quickest of historiographical sketches. The staple concerns of 20th century cultural geography were once demarcated as diverse phenomena, human in origin, taking expression or given form in terrestrial environments. This reflected a version of our world divided into three elemental parts: earth, sea, and air. And the practice of geography, geography, earth writing, if we remind ourselves of its Anglophone etymological root, was to consider, analyze, and explain the differently patterned ground that cultures produce or sometimes reduce. But across the last decade or more, the range of operations undertaken in cultural geography's name has certainly extended. And it's extended, I think, in two ways. The first, we might say, is a volumetric extension. What do I mean by the volumetric? Cultural geography's undertakings are now operating at further reaches vertically and horizontally, taking in hydrological and atmospheric milieu, as well as the substance of stratigraphy beneath the surface that we stand on. If our long-standing habit as cultural geographers has been to face landward, grounded by terrain, then today inquiries range freer, wider, deeper, looking seaward and skyward. No longer do cultural geographers only seek out, I suppose, what we could call, in rather crude terms, surficial relations, or the social processes as they occur on the surface of the earth. Indeed, cultural geographers now go subterranean, tunneling for imaginaries existing beneath our feet, the spoils of the earth. This is then a planetary turn in cultural geography, or a biospheric turn in cultural geography. It opens up a greater atlas of concerns. But at the same time, we should be mindful of the fact that it also recalls geography's ancient tradition, a heaven and earth tradition. So it's a new and it's an old version of a planetary geography. But it's one that now begins to, I think, claim interesting forms of theoretical purchase and new emotional resonance. The second extension for the more than human is biological. New cultural geographies seek to include organisms other than the human, and ecosystems or assemblages of other than human organisms. And what we're referring to, or what I'm referring to here, are not merely plant geographies or animal geographies, which of course have their own intellectual history in the subject, but also the bacterial or the mycelial, which is the world of fungi and mushrooms, and also the complex, uncategorized, post-human life forms and body subjects that are being created by advances in bioengineering, in biomedicine, and nanotechnology. Taken together, volumetrically extending and biologically extending, it would be fair to say that contemporary cultural geography is now ontologically unbound. So what would we take then as a barometer reading from this considerable level of disciplinary change? I think that these new forms of inquiry into the more than human can be said to reflect certainly an interdisciplinary or even a post-disciplinary attitude. It's one that's now widespread in academic research, to a point where, by my reading at least, it's no longer unusual to read a work published in a home that we would recognize as cultural geography that spans subject areas far beyond its provinces: ecology, sociology, pharmacology, criminology, and, say, astrobiology, all being drawn underneath the umbrella of what is called cultural geography. But it might be that this shift towards the biospheric and the planetary also offers us evidence of ambition, intellectual ambition, maybe even vaulting ambition, which is a newly minted thing among cultural geographers, with ambitions to be their very own theory builders rather than theory traffickers. Thinkers judged capable of addressing this century's great sociological challenges, doing some of the speculative thinking that is demanded by life in the Anthropocene and its search for greater ecological and social justice on a damaged planet. That then is the intellectual map that I kind of want to situate my comments in this evening. It's a new interdiscipline that I'm referring to here that still goes by the name of cultural geography. My intention in offering comment upon it is to do two things. I want to offer certain cautionary notes about this new vein of visionary thinking and its great extension and reach. I am a skeptical enthusiast of it, but I want to offer just some cautionary thoughts as a corrective. And what I want to do that for is because I still want our thinking to pivot around the historical and the geographical as a way to explore the very real complexity of being specific and being situated. Okay. What I want to do now is offer you just a bit of a theoretical toolkit that will take us forward in the talk. And I want to do that through two different concepts. One is the derangement of scale, and the other is the second body. And to do that, I've selected these from a very big bookshelf that takes in relational materialism, post-humanism, ecofeminism, the environmental humanities, process philosophy. There's an awful lot of stuff out there. Each of them represents in and of itself a movement within the human sciences and within the humanities. And I think there is philosophically a shared credo there. But what I want to do is offer you three principles that cut across all of that big bookshelf of stuff. Three principles that I think are characteristic of the more than human. And then we'll come to these two concepts. So what are the three principles that I think would characterize the more than human? Firstly, the more than human invites a collapse of scale. A collapse of scale between the planetary and the personal. The planetary and the situated. Two people's work that I think do that in interesting ways are the ecofeminists Astrida Nemansis and Stacey Alaimo. Both of their works suggest to us that we need increasingly to think about the porosity of our bodies, that our bodies are porous organisms. They welcome ways of thinking which acknowledge what they would refer to as the transcorporeal, where there is in effect a messy blending of the spaces of self and world, of page and practice. Both are specifically interested in bodies of water. Now, of course, traditionally speaking, a body of water would be something like a lake, or a reservoir, or a river. But that same phrase, of course, has double meaning. They're interested in their own body of water, in biological terms. And so bodies of water for Nemansis and Alaimo have become interesting places of transgression, where it's possible to begin to rub away at that classic idea that we have of the sovereignty of the human organism, that somehow we are individualized organisms. And instead, to acknowledge that physical organisms are actually dissolving. They are dissolute, and that there is no clear threshold between the external and the internal. So that would be the first characteristic for us to think about: the collapse of scales and the porosity of bodies. Secondly, more than human geographies invite us to do what we as humans have not been very good at if we think of the course of modern human history, and that is decenter ourselves as subjects. Decenter ourselves as a means to draw in or encompass the biodiversity of other life forms. As a new strain of ecological thinking, this is undertaken not to uphold the traditional trinity of animal, vegetable, mineral, because it no longer finds any neat fit. New nature, instead, teems and shifts. It slips and it slides. New ecologies proliferate. They disobey scientific taxonomy. They queer sexes. They affect others. This is a quite dynamic figuring of life and relations. It is, to quote my friend, but not my family member, Jamie Lorimer, a political ontology of entanglement. A political ontology of entanglement. The third characteristic of the more than human is an all-inclusive and quite exuberant attitude taken to materiality, where matter is afforded an unheralded degree of agency. Agency is extended to the non-human, and in some cases, to the inanimate or the inorganic object, ranging all the way from molecules to mountains, from ghost fishing nets to carved blocks of ice from a glacier. All of those would be objects that in a more than human mindset, we can afford degrees of significant agency. At the heart of that more than human project, there is a politics and an ethics. And it's a politics and an ethics based around a principle of radical, experimental speculation. It is progressive and positive in its attitudes. In effect, it asks, if only we ask ourselves what all of our lives share with other lives, then does it not become apparent that there are other ways that the world can work? Other ways for artful coexistence to occur. That would be to take the position of the likes of Anna Singh or Donna Haraway, Or the science fiction writer come environmental writer, recently died, Ursula Le Guin. If there are positives that come out of that progressive position, then the effects of scrambling all of those received categories and boundaries and relations and spaces that once ordained for us a human version of the world, well, all of that is not always or entirely liberating. Sometimes trying to navigate by these new maps of the more than human can actually be unexpectedly confounding or troubling. They ask us, how do we find our place in the world? And certainly, that would be an attitude shared by the eco-critic Timothy Clarke. Timothy Clarke has referred to the experience of living with this newly scrambled worldview as the derangement of scale. Now, when I read about Timothy Clarke, I knew instantly that I knew the feeling that he was talking about, or the phenomenon that he was talking about. And I suspect that you do too when I diagnose or describe it. It's a state of nervous agitation and uncertainty. It almost has a kind of quickened, caffeinated pulse to it. It's a pattern of thought that never quite settles down. And it's born of a gathering awareness of associations, correspondences, interactions that are bewilderingly complex and dynamic and promiscuous, to such a point that it disrupts the scale at which one tries to think. It skews categories of the internal and the external, and it resists inherited closed economies of accounting or explanation. It's not that eco-critic Timothy Clarke is set against it. He's just trying to diagnose what happens when you adopt that worldview. The overall force, Clarke argues, is an implosion of scales, implicating seemingly trivial or small actions with enormous stakes, while intellectual boundaries and lines of demarcation fold in upon each other. Daisy Hilliard is another person who's interested in Timothy Clarke's idea of the derangement of scale. And she's recently written about herself as a sufferer from the derangement of scale. Daisy Hilliard is a historian of science. She did her PhD in the history of science, and she's now turned herself into a sort of essayist novelist. And recently she wrote a book called The Second Body, where she recounts a personal bout of disorientation and vulnerability that she diagnosed as being the derangement of scale. Here's what she describes as her experience. Every living thing has two bodies. To be an animal is to be in possession of a physical body, a body which can eat, drink, and sleep. It's also to be embedded in a worldwide network of ecosystems. When every human body has an uncanny global presence, how can we live with ourselves, she asks. Then her attention turns to this second body, or global body. When we look at the global body, it's impossible to relate that body to anything individual because there can be no certain borders between one thing and another. We do not know what is relevant to the individual body and what is outside it, because the atmosphere and the individual body are inside one another. Therefore, we cannot help seeing every individual as part of the whole world. The whole of life becomes a mass, and it becomes impossible to differentiate one thing from another. The second body appears to pose a threat to the first body, the real one, the one you live in. Any body which is global cannot accommodate an individual who moves in her own individual way, who makes individual choices and has individual thoughts. This global body, which is entirely without boundaries, doesn't understand that individuals exist at all. So Hildyard is presenting to us this quite unsettling phenomenon, almost a spectre of ourselves, our individual selves, that exists globally. And yet any of our individualized actions we must understand and read against this global second body. Hildyard's book is fascinating as she tries to work with this spectre or this ghost of the second body, tries to find a workaround, and ultimately leaves the reader not really with an answer, just with the question of the second body. The second body at the end of Hildyard's book becomes something of a double negative. It casts a very long shadow. It might even create quite paralyzing effects. Okay, that's an awful lot of stuff. And what I want to do now is offer you one possible empirical application of this kind of magical thinking, as an effort to try and think through its far-reaching implications. And I'm going to do that with some hesitation and reservation. When I was sitting at home preparing this, I did wonder to myself if this was a good idea or not. I'm going to do that by considering the complex world history of an uncommon, enigmatic substance whose origin and status have for centuries been the subject of intrigue, speculation, fable, and myth. And my choice of substance is ambergris. Google Translate tells me that in German it's ambra. I can see one person nodding, thank you. Now I realize that ambra is not a lot to look at. So please bear with me when I tell you that it is quite sensational. The name ambergris is originally derived from the French for grey amber, ambergris, and it is the rarest bounty of the sea. It's known as floating gold, or at least it was by those who first came to treasure it, and then, recognizing its value as a luxury good on the global spice and aromatics market, to trade in it. When ambergris casts up on a beach or the coast, it is rounded and solid. In appearance, as you can see from this mixture of ambergris and not ambergris, it is no more eye-catching than any ordinary shoreline stone. Only the wiliest of beachcombers knows that ambergris is waxy to the touch, and it is uniquely aromatic. described variously as musky, musty, earthy, and animalic. Across human history, ambergris has been used as an aphrodisiac. It appeared in medical tinctures, and it has been a signature component of celebrated fragrances. It's been variously attributed protective, restorative, and spiritual properties. Al-Masudi, the 9th century geographer, now remembered as the Herodotus of the Arabs, and the author of Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems, wrote of ambergris being trafficked by camelback in caravans across the old Sahara. Casanova, the Venetian eroticist, gambler, and spy, it is said, sustained his lustful exploits with a hot chocolate concoction infused with vanilla and ambergris. The gloves of Spanish leather that were a wardrobe favourite of England's Elizabeth I, here on display at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, were oiled with ambergris. As a monarch, she knew the scent intimately. For almost 1,000 years, upon the coronation of a new British king or queen, the most sacred rite of the ceremony, one perhaps soon to be reenacted for the first time since 1953, sees the Archbishop of Canterbury, as High Priest of Church and State, anoint the new sovereign, whose modesty is protected by a golden veil upon the head, the heart, the shoulders, the elbows, and the hands, with holy oil, reputedly rare and mellow when it meets the nose, the secret recipe for which includes, oh yes, ambergris. And there it was again, released on an unsuspecting world in 1921. A base extract and a core fixative in the compound created by the industrial chemist Ernst Beau and the couturier Coco for the singular masterpiece of modern perfumery that we know as Chanel No. 5. Beautiful, still a bestseller. It's a scent that gets dabbed on slender necks and thin-veined wrists the world over. And when I was in Glasgow Airport this morning, I persuaded one of the perfume salespeople to give me a little sampler of Chanel No. 5. So if you haven't smelled it in the past, or for a little while, you'll catch a scent of it in the room now. By another version of events, for those of you that don't know, ambergris is the stuff of darkest recess and abject otherness. Ambergris concretizes in the intestinal hindgut of the sperm whale, a species that, I'm sure you'll know, has a sequence of 4 stomach chambers. Ambergris, get ready for it, is a burdensome deposit of slowly fossilizing feces. Technically, it's referred to as a coprolite, an internalized stone. It occurs in only 1% of adult sperm whales, and it's down to the whale's highly specialized diet. Their principal prey is the squid, soft-bodied, of course, but for a hard, pointed beak and a flexible, flexible feather-shaped rod which serves as its backbone. These parts of the squid prove indigestible, and when they're not properly expelled or voided, then they gather chronically, held fast in the peculiar environment of the whale's rectum. That is a biome that teems with bacteria and writhing masses of nematode worms. If ambergris can be described as having a dark inner life, then it's one that you wouldn't ever wish on your worst enemy. It is purgatory in vivo, in the belly of the whale. The substance is simultaneously a triumph and a tragedy of metabolic compression. Over time, the strain on Leviathan's innards reaches breaking point, dysfunction causing distress, eventually death, and the ruptured release of ambergris into the sea. Pathology, we should recall, is the study of pain itself, from the Greek word pathos, meaning feeling or suffering. By a third and different measure, rather than being tragic and tormented, ambergris is romantic and epic. The sperm whale is a cosmopolitan species. Its worldwide distribution explains why over centuries ambergris has been discovered beach cast all over the world. But predicting its arrival is impossible. Ambergris is naturally buoyant. The passage it takes, like all flotsam, is at the whim of trade winds, currents, tides, and the planet's precise axial tilt. And meanwhile, the chemistry that brings ambergris to aromatic maturity is still not fully known, but reputedly governed by the weathering actions of wind and wave and by the grace of the sun. It journeys the open ocean, shelterless, ownerless, for years on end. Where it makes landfall, and when, or even if, discovery occurs, are matters of pure chance. And thus the ways of the world that ambergris follows are miraculous and almost entirely arbitrary or accidental. By a fourth and final imaginary, ambergris is shape-shifting and category confounding. It is a truly transversal substance, and it's ever been thus. The earliest harvesters thought it was a foam produced at sea. Others thought it was the excrement of a species of seabird that fed off sweet-smelling herbs, or that it was the lizard musk of the crocodile. Theories of vegetable origin held that it was a mushroom or a truffle that grew at the bottom of the ocean, or that it was a perfumed fruit that upon ripening fell into the sea. Early mineralogists wondered if it might not be a sort of inorganic bitumen erupting from fountains on the ocean floor. The earliest explanation that connected ambergris with the sperm whale was also wrong-headed, speculating that what they did was swallow the stuff when they found it floating on the surface of the sea. It was not until the New England whale fishery was established that the quayside butchers revealed that ambergris was lodged intestinally. By 1934, A.C. Sterling, the world's leading authority on ambergris and the supplier to the flavour and fragrance industries, noted with, I think, characteristic English understatement, quote, that the contrast between its origin and its use is sufficiently striking to excite imagination. A.C. Sterling's co-investigator, the renowned interwar perfumier W.A. Poucher, drew up the first system of chemical classification for ambergris extract, noting 10 differentiations that could be made according to geography, coloration, texture, and aroma. A trained industrialist, Poucher knew the potential value of synthetic artifice in an age of chemical reproduction. Ambergris was prized for its velvetiness, a velvetiness that it imparted on the body of the wearer, but also as a fixative, because it retained a scent long after it had been applied to human skin. Qualities that were not yet at the time replicable by industrial process or biomimicry. Indeed, it was another 70 years until the scientific community and the perfume industry settled on a full explanatory theory for the architecture of ambergris and then its synthetic replication. Ambroxan, the synthetic, is now used extensively in the perfume industry. But demand from artisanal perfumers continues to fuel a secretive trade in the real stuff. There's a shady world of online business-to-business commerce that connects up dealers, sellers, and buyers operating in Taiwan, Singapore, Dubai, and Ukraine. And so it is then that the sperm whale's hunting habits in the abyssal depths to satisfy a fondness for the taste of squid, that through long years of incubation entangle up with the ephemeral history of perfume and the tender intimacies of scent that we can all smell in the room right now. What one body internalizes as hard fecal matter is distilled, adjusted, and then spritzed onto the surface of another, so that it might become more desirable. Ambergris is a substance that misted its way into public life. It glamorized private lives. It formed an ocean of modern air. First sensed, later remembered. Biology becomes geology, becomes atmosphere, becomes, in matter of fact, aura. And so it's not enough to say that ambergris encapsulates a multi-species more than human geography. It's more accurate to say that it is repeatedly more than human and heterogeneous. It's drawn into geographic, economic, and scientific networks. It's transitioned between nature, art, industry, beauty cultures, ancient and modern. Okay. Two very different elements there, and what I want to do now in my third and concluding part of this talk is just try and draw things together. What do I hope you're going to take away from a tale simultaneously told at a planetary scale and internal to the belly of the whale? 3 things. 2 of them for quick report, and the last one just requiring a little concluding explanation. 1, I'm interested in how this story, which I'm just beginning to work through, and I will continue to write, can continue to feed a new scholarly appetite for what I might refer to as stomach stories. These are, as I've demonstrated, simultaneously gross and grand. The more than human presences found internal to human bodies are increasingly of interest to geographers and researchers in cognate subject areas, all the way from crystallized deposits to parasitic worms. Time doesn't permit me to go into great detail about that work, but I will name check once again my namesake, Jamie Lorimer, with a really fascinating new piece of writing into the fringe science of gut buddies, where the prospect of hosting microbial kin is something electively or voluntarily done as a means to tackle autoimmune diseases. So the stomach story, I think, becomes a fascinating prospect for us to think through. Secondly, this story of Ambergris might also be taken to be indicative of something that is just kind of happening now, and I know that people get tired of turns, but there's a turn happening which is referred to as the chemical turn. And chemo or chemoethnographies are some things being done at present across the social sciences and the humanities. And these studies seek to approach chemicals and chemistry ontologically. Ontologically as phenomena where the material and the molecular are part of the entanglements of our bodies and life itself. There is a long tradition, of course, of cultural geography colonizing new subject areas to mine them for possible new frontiers, and I think the chemical turn probably represents that new frontier. Thirdly, and finally, I think what this story does is signal that need for caution. Caution in how we tell narratives about the more than human, or how we experiment with narratives of the more than human. There is a risk attendant with adopting a radically open attitude to the more than human as a form of ecological thought that is sympathetic, that is interested in, if you like, the conviviality of life. And the risk is that we make everything connect up with everything. Hope rests in a lot of more than human thinking by summoning up new coalitions, new bio-geosocial coalitions, new forms of life that might differ from that which is preceded, that might be better, more just. Nothing is ruled out. The impulse is to discover convergence and concurrence, and that is very strong. The assemblage is a spatial concept that encourages us to think in converging terms. And it's reflected in lots of more than human research and writing at present, much of which elects to dwell in the border areas or in the interzone. And by dwelling in the border areas or the interzone, what emerges is, well, the emergent. And so you can kind of end up with a situation where what you're looking for is what you find. There is detectable an urgency to infer or even to will these assemblages and these affinities into greater and greater association and connection. There is a great temptation to think always of interrelation, of association and new recombination. It's something that the anthropologist Alf Hornberg has referred to as unbridled association, or unfettered association. And he's actually directed his criticism very directly, and by my judgment, too personally, recently at Donna Haraway and Anna Singh. And I'm not going to spend time thinking about the more personal aspects of Hornberg's critique. But what I do think is worth thinking seriously about is the case that he makes against this form of associational or tentacular theory, like a tentacle forever reaching outward. He rails against a sense of wonder that colours accounts of multi-species interrelation. Certainly those that assume that what is revealed is always revelatory. And he also rails particularly against a form of writing about the more than human and about the tentacular or the associational that he judges to be, quote, no, it isn't quote, sorry, that's me paraphrasing him, fogged in ontological ambiguity. Ultimately, the challenge, therefore, might be one of thinking about the more than human, thinking about possible connections, yet at the same time exercising relational restraint, so as to look for the complexity that exists within the situated and the specific. To repeat one sentence from my story of Ambergris, the ways of the world that Ambergris follows are miraculous, but also entirely arbitrary and accidental. If there's a fable in that Ambergris story, then I think it is that not everything connects, that misses can outnumber hits, that false starts, wrong turns, and long ways around are part of association in life. Our unfinished world, which is the one that is written off with such enthusiasm at present, our unfinished world, of course, contains many more things that are adrift than ambergris. Think of pollen floating in mid-air. Think of plankton efflorescing in large bodies of water, but unable to swim against the current or the swell. And then there are the great multitudes, the billions of protozoa, single-celled microorganisms, both free-living and parasitic, that inhabit freshwater and maritime environments. Being afloat, being adrift, is a different possibility, sets up a wholly different set of eco-social relations. Being adrift causes things to slip away as much as to slip towards. In a forthcoming essay, I think it came out yesterday. No, today, the 31st of January, in a current essay then, the environmental thinker Bron Sijerski actually starts thinking about a theory of drift. This is what he writes. Things adrift can help us trace the lineaments of a new planetary ethic, an ethic that extends beyond the human, the animal, and the living to the whole extended body of the earth, that allows us to reconceptualize human practices of drifting within a planetary context, that's sensitive to the debt that all moving things owe to the planetary mobility commons that enables their motion, and that helps us to recognize our obligations of care towards all drifting things. This is highly speculative stuff, but Siekierski asks us what might it be to invite a new socio-ecological theory of drift. One that sees drifting things on the move actually as a means for rethinking that more than human ontological condition. I go to lots of talks where the speaker just stops. And I've been to lots of talks where the speaker just stops and then the audience are meant to ask questions. And I've got tired of that dynamic. And so, with the permission of my hosts, this is my final slide. And it gives you a set of questions to consider for a few minutes with your neighbor in your audience. And then, on the basis of that set of conversations that you've had prompted by these questions, maybe then we could have some questions if people are agreeable to that, so that a little bit of a conversation serves as a bridgehead between the end of me finishing so that I can catch my breath, have a little glass of water, and you then can have a think about what you want to ask me, okay? So here are my questions. If an associative or a relational state of mind is the spirit of the age, then what sort of academic inquiries result? And what is the object of inquiry? 2, what is the operating methodology for associational studies of our more than human world? How does it get studied? How does it get done? What is the research practice? 3, how should these more than human worlds be written into existence? And connected to that, by what narrative style should they be told? And finally, not forgetting the fact that many of us here are teacher educators as well as researchers, what are the most effective and affective ways of teaching students to think of their existence in more than human terms? I spoke to my first year students about the concept of the second body earlier on this month. I've yet to find out whether that had any connection with them at all in terms of their own existence. So those are the questions. Christian, you're okay with this? I haven't told you about it. If you want to have a chat about those questions for, let's say, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, is that good? And then we'll have some questions, if that's okay. All right, Grant. Okay, folks, we'll bring your lively conversations to a close. That sounded like fun. Has anyone got any questions now arising from their conversation or just from the talk? This is like the classic phenomenon. Yeah.
Maybe more of a comment than a question, because no one asked a question. And concerning your talk, actually, not the conversation we just had, because we also talked about your talk.
Yeah.
About your criticism also towards the end of multi-species studies and this sense of wonder, and that's maybe also exaggerated or dangerous or not appropriate. And while I understand what you mean, I think, so my first point is a kind of a defense of Donna Haraway, because I think that while she maybe inspires all this awe, she herself is also often talks about that neither hope nor despair is the right reaction, and then we should be sensible and kind of live with destruction. And as a second point, I think that maybe this tendency that we should also look at it maybe from an historical point of view, that maybe that's also kind of a reaction towards this overly science-critical early STS and maybe political ecology, where everything from the natural sciences was seen as constructed and bashed and not true. So maybe now this is kind of a move of kind of discovering, maybe it's a bit naive, but discovering the beauty of the natural sciences and seeing, wow, this is actually amazing that all these animals do so much. And while I agree with you that maybe that can be problematic and it is also maybe sometimes a bit naive, maybe it also can be a first step to real interdisciplinary cooperation.
Yeah, those are terrific comments, and I think I would be absolutely aligned with them. And I think that if my talk represents a critique, it's a light critique. I'm almost asking for, it's almost like an adjustment. And that's, in some senses, that's quite a mild thing to ask for. But it's that sense in which the unfettered enthusiasm to connect and to find new forms of connection has ended up creating almost a kind of a pre-modeled approach, I think. And I think what we need to think about actually are the diversities of ways in which connection happens or doesn't happen. And so that's why something like the figure of being adrift or afloat actually creates hesitancy, creates a pause, actually begins to make us think about exactly what type of socio-ecological relationship we're talking about. So that's the first one, is that it would just be a mild adjustment rather than a strong critique. Do you want me to take it off? That might be less disruptive. Oh, because you... The other point that you make, I think, is a terrific one, actually, about taking science seriously. Of course, that's always been at the heart of STS as a project. It's always been at the heart of STS as a project. I think that maybe it's as much about the manner of the language that's used to communicate the science, I think. And here maybe that is another one of my kind of cautions and uncertainties about this work, is that it seems to be producing, this is where I'll be at my strongest, a quite derivative language. And that language actually ends up blanching out or irradiating some of the very texture of the life worlds that are being explored. Because what you end up with is a repetition of a certain kind of, let me just call it a language of ontics and ontology, actually which ends up not being about the very specific ecological situation that's being described. And in many senses, science has the language, and it might actually be about a greater faith in the language of science to produce that more arresting and enriching narrative account of what's being described, rather than an effort to translate those very interesting phenomena into the theoretical language. And so in part, I think it's a question of choice of language, yeah. But thank you. Yeah. I'm going to try not moving at all to see if that...
Thank you very much for that interesting talk. I want to follow up to the previous speaker, and I'm very glad that you used the term, or for the first time I hear the word science in this room, because I felt somewhat alienated. I am a scientist, and I was always a geoscientist, as a matter of fact, and I felt quite alienated or struck by the impression that the humanities now finally discover that humans are a part of a larger world, and interconnected and in these biological and geological networks. And well, this is something that the sciences have discovered at least since the mid-19th century. And well, welcome. Come talk with us.
Well, I think the first thing to say is, of course, many geographers would still recognize themselves as scientists, right? They would be social scientists as opposed to natural scientists. I think, though, what you also raise, of course, is this, yes, the realization, of course, that we have never been what we thought we were. But of course, if that's a recent realization, then it's only a recent realization for some of us. Indigenous populations have, of course, always understood themselves entirely differently by animist belief systems where they're operating by an entirely different cosmology, yes. So in some senses, it has been a trick of modernity, yes, to have us begin to configure ourselves in such a way that we are separate. But yes, you can rest assured there's now 2 decades of hard thinking in the social sciences and the humanities, which are opening up the possibility of a conversation, certainly, yeah, where science is actually taken seriously, but taken seriously such as to understand its practices and operations, where expertise is actually understood as something that is practiced. And I think that would be the crucial difference, actually, that the approach to science is to understand science itself as a culture. And maybe that recognition is not shared by all your fellow scientists, yeah, that science is a culture.
Yeah, there's still these 2 cultures between humanities and science. When will this recognition reach politics so that we may aid the world as it is, provide for our future generations?
I think it's a good question. It's a huge question. If I talk about the research landscape in the disunited kingdom, where I'm from, otherwise known as the UK, I would say actually that there is considerable effort at the moment, and there is a direction of travel towards funding programs which are truly interdisciplinary. Now, there are ups and downs of that recent trend. In the UK, our research landscape, at least through funding councils, has, over the course of the last quarter century, been organised according to arts and humanities, natural, environmental, social sciences, biological, and you applied to your respective councils. And that almost gave you a kind of badge of identity and a mode of operation. Those council identities are dissolving, or being dissolved into one body. And part of the thinking for that one body is, well, it's budget saving, of course. But intellectually, it is about a kind of thematized, challenge-based or challenge-facing and solution-identifying approach. The appeal of that, of course, is that it is interdisciplinary. The downside, potentially, because this is still early days, but I think the downside is sometimes that it produces a certain type of, how would I describe it? It produces round-headed rather than cavalier science. It is not necessarily the most adventurous because people have to find a meeting point. Now, the meeting point can sometimes be actually a point of adventure, but sometimes it's also a safety zone where the common ground is found. So I think in the UK, there are experiments currently unfolding to try and see how, in effect, science then informs policy in a different way. And science reaches into politics in a different way. Within a university sector, it's still very early, though. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Acoustics seem to be quite good in the room. I'm picking up on the metaphor that you've kind of given us. It's too tempting. Drifting apart is the metaphor that comes to me, to my mind. To what extent does the richness that we now see in engagements with the modern human present a risk for us as a discipline, to the extent that we might invent a lot of new languages, but we lose a language for talking to each other. We have colleagues working in such different fields now that I am actually worried that at some point we lose the ability to honestly engage with each other's thinking, just because we do not have the same background, we don't have the same expertise. I cannot pretend to be an expert in neurosciences and an expert in psychology and an expert in computer technologies and whatever else. I haven't even got a language for that, as you can see. So at what point are we at risk of actually drifting apart as a discipline where we need a language for talking to each other and expertise that we share?
I think it's a reasonable concern to hold. I'm getting older than I think I am, but I have been part of cultural geography as a kind of scholarly and professional community now for 25 years. And it would certainly be true to say that the cultural geography that I grew up in when I was a new and emerging academic looked inward to reference itself and understood itself by a form of dialogue and communication which was largely introspective. And that was good in many ways, because it was the kind of period that I think is now recognized in Germany as kind of the cultural turn, right? That's kind of where new cultural geography came from as a gathering point for German geographers. The alternative to that is the outrospective rather than introspective, the centripetal force rather than the centrifugal force. I definitely feel that in the UK at the moment, then the power and the direction of travel is centripetal, out. I guess there's a positive kind of spin to take on your question, which is maybe by going out and talking to other forms of expertise, what you create are new languages, new areas of interest that you then bring back into what everybody is continuing to call new cultural geography or cultural geography. But I get the point. I know what you're saying. You can end up with a situation where you actually have a hollowing out of what traditionally have been recognized as disciplinary hearths and homes. And there's a great security to be found in that. I'm sure we'll share it and feel it over the next 2.5 days. I guess it's a balance needs to be struck between not eroding or undermining a disciplinary or subdisciplinary identity to the point where people no longer have a language to talk to one another, whilst at the same time questing outside to try and find interesting things to traffic back in again. I'm always a third-way person and an integrationist, and I know my answer sounds exactly like that. But I think there are good things that can come from talking inwards, and there are good things that can come from going outwards too. Thank you. Anyone got any solutions to these questions that I was asking? Because that's really what I was attempting to do here. You know, I'm trying to crowdsource some answers, and anything you can do to help me, please. If not, then Christian, shall we wrap things up?
I'll probably try to add an answer, so at least you get one. Even though it might not be the most intelligent one. If an associative relational state of mind is the spirit of age, what is the object of inquiry? And as a pragmatist, I would argue it's transactional relations. It's that what connects things, beings, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or what else should it be? I mean, you had something in mind. Hayden, isn't it?
Well, I suppose that maybe the question becomes, is it the transactional relation that is the object of inquiry? Do you begin with the assemblage, or is it the object? Is it Ambergris? Where do you begin with that? If you imagine that as a kind of as a possible research project, I suppose it's the classic question about do you begin with the entire thing, or do you begin with one element? And I suppose increasingly I'm persuaded of the view that I'll begin with the one as a means to implode everything from it. And I guess that's what I'm kind of getting at with that idea of the second body, is that from any individual body, what you create then is this planetary body. From any one phenomenon, Ambergris, you can then implode an entire kind of planetary story. That quote at the bottom here by Joseph Dummett is I think, helpful for two reasons. The second sentence asks us, he in effect says, you know, there are a number of different threads we can follow. The thread that we follow, what thread to follow is an analytical, imaginative, physical, and political choice. That quote is taken actually from an article that Dummett wrote about a teaching exercise that he used when he taught on Donna Haraway's course, in actual fact, at University of California, or San Diego, I forget. But the exercise in teaching students was simply take a thing from your life, and then begin to understand that thing. You know, in effect, begin to track and trace what it is in terms of the transactional relations that brought it to be with you right here, right now. The microphone, the leather shoes that you're wearing. Take a thing and begin. And so Dummett offers us then, actually in a really interesting way, a kind of pedagogic model by which we can then begin to understand the more than humanness of that thing. And so for me, maybe I'm different from you actually, that you want to begin with the transactional relations. I actually want to begin with the thing. And of course that then begins to determine the nature of the story that you tell, or at least the direction of travel for the story. So I think it's an interesting quandary. It's mirrored in kind of literary publishing. It has been over the course of the last 20 years. You know, you can find cod, a global history, salt, a global history. You could take any phenomenon and someone's written a kind of popular account. I think actually we can be quite snobbish about that. Or alternatively, we can think, well, actually it must work, right? It's kind of really appealing for the reader. There's something about beginning with literally the object of inquiry and then spinning things out from it. So I think there's actually much to be found academically from beginning to think in those terms.